when an avoidant finds out your self-respect is stronger than their ego. Most avoidants expect distance to give them emotional control over the relationship dynamic. They believe they can pull away whenever closeness begins feeling uncomfortable or overwhelming. They assume the connection will remain available whenever they decide to return again. And for a while, that assumption often appears to be completely correct. The anxious partner waits while the avoidant decides how close things can become. The empath understands while the avoidant protects themselves behind emotional walls and silence. But eventually, something changes that the avoidant never expected to happen at all. The person who always adjusted suddenly stops abandoning themselves to keep peace alive. The person who chased the relationship suddenly starts protecting their own dignity instead. That moment changes everything about the emotional balance between both people involved. Because avoidants are used to emotional persistence much more than emotional boundaries. They are familiar with second chances arriving after repeated disappointments and withdrawals. What they often struggle to understand is quiet emotional self-respect and consistency. Self-respect does not scream, threaten, manipulate, or demand attention from anyone nearby. Self-respect simply decides what it will accept and what it will not. And that quiet decision can feel surprisingly powerful to an avoidant partner. Because ego expects access that self-respect is no longer willing to provide freely. The avoidant sends a message expecting the old dynamic to immediately return. But this time, the conversation feels different from every conversation before it. The replies remain kind, but they no longer carry desperation or fear. The emotional urgency that once existed has quietly disappeared from the interaction. The avoidant notices the difference even if they never mention it directly. For perhaps the first time, they realize your world no longer revolves around them. You still care, but you are no longer sacrificing yourself to prove it. You still appreciate them, but you no longer accept emotional breadcrumbs as enough. You still wish them well, but you no longer wait endlessly for clarity. That is often when the avoidant's ego begins feeling deeply challenged and uncomfortable. Not because you became cruel, cold, or emotionally unavailable toward them intentionally, but because your self-respect removed privileges that your pain once provided freely. Your availability was never guaranteed even if they believed that it was. Your patience was never unlimited even if they treated it that way. And your love was never permission to ignore your emotional needs repeatedly. Many avoidants mistake self-respect for punishment during the beginning stages of detachment. They assume boundaries exist to hurt them rather than protect your peace. But healthy boundaries are not attacks against another person's emotional comfort or ego. They are simply decisions about how you deserve to be treated consistently. That realization often creates confusion inside avoidants who expected the old pattern. The person who tolerated inconsistency suddenly values consistency more than promises. The person who feared abandonment suddenly stops abandoning themselves for connection. The person who once begged for effort now quietly observes actions instead. Because avoidants are often prepared for conflict, but not emotional independence. They know how to respond to anger, because anger still signals attachment and investment. What unsettles them is calm acceptance and emotional stability without resentment or bitterness. The silence feels different because it is no longer asking for anything. The absence feels different because it may actually be permanent this time. That possibility forces many avoidants to confront emotions they usually avoid feeling. What if this person no longer needs me in the same way? What if they finally realize their value and decided not to settle anymore? Those questions create discomfort that distance alone can no longer solve easily. Some avoidants begin reaching out more frequently than they ever did before. Others suddenly become curious about conversations they once avoided having entirely. Some become more affectionate, while others become noticeably more emotionally expressive. The rules they once followed suddenly begin collapsing under fear and uncertainty. The rule about never chasing suddenly feels less important than preserving connection. The rule about emotional distance suddenly feels much less safe than before, because fear of losing someone can overpower fear of intimacy temporarily. But there is another truth that many people overlook in these situations. Sometimes they lose the version of you that accepted less than you deserved. They lose the version of you that waited without asking difficult questions. And that loss can feel bigger than they ever expected possible. Because people often appreciate emotional safety only after it disappears completely. They remember the understanding they rarely acknowledged while it still existed. And they remember the warmth they once believed they could revisit any time. That is why some avoidants return with a completely different energy afterward. Not because your value suddenly increased overnight in some magical way. Your value was always there whether they recognized it or not. The difference is that your self-respect forced them to finally see it. But this is where many people make a serious mistake emotionally. They assume returning automatically means growth and emotional maturity have happened already. Sometimes avoidants become self-aware and start healing old emotional wounds seriously. But sometimes they simply miss access rather than missing the relationship itself. That is why actions always matter more than promises during reconciliation attempts. Consistency reveals growth much more clearly than emotional words ever can. Real change survives comfort instead of disappearing after the crisis passes quietly. The most powerful response to an avoidance ego is not punishment or revenge. The most powerful response is protecting your dignity without losing your kindness. Because self-respect does not need to win arguments or prove worth to anyone. It simply refuses to negotiate with treatment that damages peace and stability. Ironically, that is often when avoidants finally see you most clearly. Not when you chase them through confusion, silence, and mixed signals repeatedly. And not when you place their comfort above your emotional well-being every time. They see you clearly when your standards become stronger than your fear. They see you clearly when your boundaries become stronger than their ego. Because nothing changes an avoidance perspective faster than losing automatic access. And nothing commands more respect than someone who finally respects themselves first. That is the moment the emotional balance changes forever between both people. Because once self-respect becomes stronger than their ego, the old rules disappear. And once that happens, the relationship can never return to what it was before.